Bruce Smith is recognized as one of the greatest defensive players in NFL history, a name deeply etched into every discussion about absolute dominance at the defensive end position. He was the #1 overall selection in the NFL draft in 1985 by the Buffalo Bills, a decision that completely changed the face of the team's defense for nearly 2 decades. Throughout a career that spanned 19 seasons, Bruce Smith set a historic record with 200 sacks in the NFL regular season, a milestone that to this day is still considered an untouchable standard for every defensive end. He was selected to 11 Pro Bowls, earned 8 All-Pro honors, and won the NFL Defensive Player of the Year award twice. Affirming his sustained dominance across many generations of opponents, Bruce was the cornerstone of the Buffalo Bills during their golden era, when the team made 4 consecutive Super Bowl appearances from 1990 to 1993, a rare achievement in NFL history. Even though he never won a Super Bowl championship, he was still honored when he was inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame in 2009, along with the College Football Hall of Fame, solidifying his undisputed legendary status in American football. Behind those great numbers was a man who lived under non-stop pressure and pains that were never fully seen. Bruce Smith did not only fight opponents on the field, but also fought the enormous expectations placed on his shoulders from the day he was chosen #1 overall. Every time he stepped onto the field, he did not only represent himself, but also carried the hopes of an entire city of Buffalo that was thirsting for glory. But when the consecutive Super Bowl failures came, especially the historic streak of 4 losses, that mental burden turned into a lingering wound that lasted throughout his career. He continued to play with astonishing endurance, still maintaining dominant form even as his body was worn down through each season. But inside was a will forged from disappointment and an unfulfilled desire. Bruce Smith did not collapse, but he also never truly felt complete because every individual success always came with a collective void that could not be filled. Before we continue the journey full of pressure and the moments that shaped Bruce Smith, please hit subscribe and leave a like as a token of appreciation for a man who turned heavy expectations into greatness on the football field. It is not only a story about records, but also the story of a boy who grew up in silence and became a legend through an unyielding will. Let us step into the next part of that journey. Bruce Smith was born into a world that did not have much softness, where emotions were not named and sharing was almost non-existent. After the early years already shaped by heavy expectations, his childhood continued to pass in a space where silence became the rule, and understanding was as rare as a luxury. In the family, Bruce did not often hear simple words of encouragement like, "You did well," or "You are okay." But instead, there were invisible but constant demands to improve more, to be stronger, to not be allowed to fail. Every achievement did not bring relief, but only opened a new, higher, farther, and harder to reach standard. In that environment, Bruce gradually formed the feeling that he was not seen as a child growing up, but as someone who was always being evaluated, always being watched, always having to prove his own value in the smallest actions, with no warm moments long enough to become peaceful memories. Bruce's childhood was like a long chain of days filled with silence and observation. Conversations in the family did not carry the color of sharing, but carried the nature of evaluation and correction. When a child needs recognition to build self-confidence, Bruce instead learned to find that recognition on his own, in the strict looks and standards that were never lowered. That made him understand early that his own value was not something that existed naturally, but something that had to be constantly earned, constantly proven. And if he stopped even for a moment, it could disappear. Even at school, where it should have offered an escape from family pressure, Bruce did not find any lightness. School did not open a different world, but only reflected the same world he was already familiar with at home, where achievement came first, where mistakes were not allowed to last, where every child had to compete so as not to be left behind. Bruce was not an outstanding student in the academic sense, but he carried a constant tension inside, as if every test, every practice, every demand was part of the same invisible, endless competition. In that environment, sports began to become the only escape, not in the sense of entertainment or relaxation, but as a real way to exist. On the football field, Bruce for the first time felt that he could be recognized without needing to explain, without needing to justify, without needing to say too much. Strength, speed, and dedication were enough to create attention. When his body collided on the field, when he charged into opponents, when he pushed beyond his physical limits, those were the rare moments when the world around him seemed clearer and easier to understand. There were no more complex evaluating looks. Only the result: either he broke through or he was broken through. But even in that seemingly free environment, another form of pressure was born. The better he performed, the more Bruce was expected. The more he stood out, the more he was pushed away from the normal life of a child. No one saw the fatigue inside, because it was all covered by the numbers, the defensive plays, the moments of physical explosion. Recognition came quickly, but it did not bring peace. It brought a new responsibility to maintain, to repeat, to surpass himself once again. From a very early age, Bruce began to learn how to push himself, to set higher demands than anyone else could place on him. When no one said, "You have to try harder," he said it to himself. When no one demanded perfection, he turned it into his living standard. This gradually created an extremely harsh internal discipline that helped him become an outstanding athlete, but at the same time also made his childhood gradually disappear in the prolonged silence. Friends his age could find joy in the simplicity of youth, but Bruce always carried a different feeling. He did not live in the state of just playing, but in the state of proving. Even when he left the practice field, his mind did not completely leave that invisible competition. Every day that passed was a small step in the journey to become good enough. But that concept of enough always moved farther away every time he got closer to it. Silence became part of his personality, not because he had nothing to say, but because the space around him never truly listened in the way a child needed to be listened to. In the rare moments of quiet, Bruce did not find rest, but only felt more clearly the pressure that followed him from every direction. In that prolonged silence, Bruce Smith grew up as a man made more from pressure than from support, from expectations more than from comfort, and from survival, will more than from the peace of childhood. Every step he took was not just the natural development of a child, but the accumulation of demands that were never loosened, standards that were never lowered, and expectations that never disappeared. Bruce Smith began to step into his high school years with something that even he did not fully understand at the time. His body was developing faster than everyone around him. No one had to explain that he was different. Just by looking at the way he moved on the field, the way he closed in on opponents, the way he claimed space, everyone realized that this was not a normal high school boy. It was a superior physique, almost born to dominate physical confrontations. But what was especially painful was that while the outside world began to see a talent, Bruce still only felt like a boy trying to survive under the nameless pressure that had followed him from before. In high school, football became the first place where Bruce Smith was no longer seen as a normal boy. He was no longer evaluated through grades or classroom comments, but through every run, every collision, every time he made an opponent back off. But this recognition was not personal. People did not see Bruce as a person growing up, but as a developing sports phenomenon. His body began to be talked about more than his own name. People talked about strength, about speed, about the ability to break through defensive lines. But very few people actually asked how Bruce was feeling behind those movements. It was from this period that a quiet but profound change began to take place. Bruce Smith was no longer allowed to just be a student playing sports. He became something else in the eyes of coaches, in the eyes of teammates, and in the eyes of the entire surrounding system, a talent that had to be exploited. Coaches did not see him as a person who needed balanced development, but as a winning tool that needed to be constantly sharpened. Every practice was not only training, but a check to see if he was still strong enough to meet the new expectations. Every mistake was not seen as a natural part of the learning process, but as something that needed to be fixed immediately, with no time for delay. In that environment, Bruce gradually understood that he no longer had the right to be weak. If at home he had to prove his own value through perfection, then on the football field he had to prove it through non-stop superiority. There was no safe zone between these two worlds, and that made the line between person and player inside him begin to blur. He was no longer allowed to be seen as a boy with a childhood, but as a body serving a goal much larger than himself. Sports, which had once been an escape, now gradually turned into another form of pressure. But unlike the invisible pressure in the family, the pressure on the field had a clearer shape. Opponents, time, results, and expectations. Bruce began to understand that if he slowed down even a little, someone else would overtake him. If he was not strong enough in one moment, all the recognition could disappear. That left him with no permission to relax. Even when his body was tired, his mind continued to push, continued to drive him beyond the natural limits of a growing boy. In high school, the conversations about Bruce Smith began to change. It was no longer, "he plays ball well," but "he can go much farther." Those words sounded positive, but to Bruce they felt more like a binding than praise, because every time someone said he had a future, he felt his present shrinking a little more. He was no longer allowed to just live in the present. Every action was pulled toward the future, toward an image he had never chosen but was forced to head toward, the NFL. When the talk about a professional future began to appear, Bruce did not feel excited as people expected. Instead, he felt a new form of pressure forming, because the NFL was no longer a distant dream, but became a pre-written conclusion for his life. Once you were seen as good enough, you no longer had the right to slow down. You no longer had the right to change direction. You could only continue moving forward, whether you were truly ready or not. In all of that, the most painful thing was not the harshness of training or the competition, but the increasingly clear isolation. Bruce Smith began to realize that the better he became, the fewer people could truly understand him. Teammates saw him as a weapon, coaches saw him as a solution, and the outside world saw him as a future. But no one saw him as a boy trying to hold on to himself amid all those definitions. His body became the thing talked about more than his mind. His strength became the main story, while the emotions inside were gradually pushed to the edge. No one asked if he was tired, because in their eyes, fatigue was something that did not fit with a person seen as different. And that was why Bruce learned to hide every sign of weakness, not because he wanted to, but because he understood that in his world weakness had no place to exist. But deep inside, every time he stepped onto the field, every collision, every time he was praised, Bruce felt himself moving farther away from a part of his true self. The bigger his body grew, and the more his fame began to form, the deeper the void inside became. It was not the confidence of a rising star, but the silence of a person gradually being reshaped by the world's expectations into something he could not stop to change. And in that silence, the path to the NFL future no longer looked like a choice, but became an irreversible current that carried Bruce Smith farther from his childhood, farther from peace, and closer to a destiny he had never truly been asked if he wanted or not. Joining Virginia Tech was the moment Bruce Smith stepped out of the scope of a local talent and entered a world where every movement of his began to be watched, analyzed, and given expectations. But even when stepping into the new environment, the old feeling did not completely disappear. He did not enter college like a child looking for an opportunity. but like a body already shaped to become the center of every gaze. At Virginia Tech, Bruce quickly not only adapted, but also became an irreplaceable cornerstone of the defense, a presence that forced opponents to change their entire approach to the game just to deal with him. Right from the first seasons, Bruce Smith showed a rare level of dominance. His strength came not only from superior physique, but from the combination of speed, reflexes, and an almost instinctive ability to read situations. While opponents were still trying to organize their formation, Bruce had already penetrated the gaps and broken the offensive structure in just a few seconds. He was not simply a defensive player, but became a force that reshaped the way people viewed the defensive end position in college football. With every game that passed, his presence became clearer, heavier, and impossible to ignore. But along with the dominance on the field was a quiet change in the way the world viewed Bruce Smith. He was no longer described as a developing player, but began to be attached to bigger, heavier words with longer-lasting definitions: elite, dominant, unstoppable. Those words sounded like praise, but to Bruce they began to become a new form of pressure, because every time he played well, the expectations were raised another level. And in the world of elite sports, expectations never go down. They can only keep climbing. The peak of this period was the number 46 sacks in his Virginia Tech career, an achievement that drew national attention. But what was worth noting was not only the number, but the way it changed Bruce's position in the eyes of the sports public. From an outstanding college player, he became a national phenomenon. The media began to call him one of the most fearsome defensive forces in the college football system. The analyses no longer asked whether he was good or not, but began to focus on what he would become at a higher level. The NFL was no longer a distant possibility, but became an almost certain conclusion. However, it was precisely at the moment when the world began to see Bruce Smith's bright future that inside him a more subtle form of pressure began to form. Success no longer brought the feeling of release like before. Instead, it created a new loop. The better he played, the more he was expected. The more he was expected, the more he had to maintain a state where decline was not allowed. There was no pause between success and responsibility. Every game was no longer an opportunity to show himself, but a mandatory test that had to be passed. In the fiercely competitive environment of Virginia Tech, Bruce Smith gradually became the center of every tactic. Opponents built plans just to limit him. Coaches put him in the most important situations. Teammates looked to him as a pillar. But what no one saw was the growing isolation inside that very central position. When a person becomes the pillar, they are also simultaneously separated from the rest. Bruce was no longer allowed to fail like a normal player. He only had two states: either dominate or be seen as not meeting expectations. The NFL draft pressure began to appear like an unavoidable shadow. Every game, every season was pulled toward one single question: where would he be selected and who would he become in the professional world? That question was not one Bruce asked himself, but it covered every experience of his. Even when he was playing his best, part of his mind was still pulled toward the future, where everything would be judged at a different, harsher, colder level. Success at Virginia Tech therefore no longer carried a simple meaning. It was not only the wins, the sacks, or the moments of dominance. It became a process of accumulating responsibility. Every step forward Bruce took on the field was also a step that pulled him farther from the carefree state of youth. No one said directly to him that he was carrying too many expectations, but every look silently confirmed it. And Bruce, with the sensitivity formed from his childhood, understood it more clearly than anyone. Deep inside, the loneliness he had experienced since he was young did not disappear at Virginia Tech. It only changed shape. Before, it was the loneliness of a child who was not understood. Now, it was the loneliness of a person being seen by the whole world, but with no one truly touching the human part inside. He stood in the lights of the field, amid the cheers and the praise, But inside there existed a silence that no one else could step into. Virginia Tech, therefore, was not only the place where Bruce Smith became an outstanding player. It was the place where he began to understand that greatness does not come easily. It always comes with a nameless burden, an irreversible change in the way a person views himself. And from here, the path to the NFL was no longer a simple dream, but became a journey where every step forward was paid for with an increasingly large trade-off of his own youth, freedom, and the feeling of normalcy that he had never truly been able to enjoy fully. The moment Bruce Smith's name was called as the #1 overall selection in the NFL draft in 1985 was not only a turning point in his career, but also the moment an entire city of Buffalo placed its entire future on the shoulders of one single person. It was no longer simply a young player stepping into the professional league, but a newly created symbol of hope in a city that was thirsting to break free from years of lacking glory. When the name Bruce Smith rang out, it carried not only expectation, but also an almost absolute feeling that he would be the solution to everything Buffalo had been missing. Right from the first day he set foot in the NFL environment, Bruce was no longer viewed as a normal rookie. He was not allowed to develop over time like other players. In the eyes of the coaching staff, the media, and the fans, he was already the answer. The Buffalo Bills did not just select a player, they selected a future. And that future was placed directly on Bruce Smith's shoulders without any buffer to breathe. The atmosphere around him changed immediately. Every practice was no longer a process of adaptation, but a continuous verification of whether he was worthy of the #1 position. Every play was no longer about learning, but became proof to show that the team's choice was correct. Bruce quickly realized that in the NFL world, draft position was not just a number, but an invisible contract with pressure that lasted throughout the entire career. The Buffalo Bills at that time were in the process of rebuilding their image and strength. The city of Buffalo, accustomed to unfulfilled seasons, looked at Bruce as the only ray of light that could break the long cycle of disappointment. But because of that, every smallest mistake of his was magnified. A missed play was no longer a personal error, but became a question mark about the future of the entire team. An imperfect game not only disappointed Bruce, but also brought disappointment to millions of people placing their faith in him. The heaviest thing was not playing in the NFL, but the fact that Bruce Smith no longer had the right to separate himself from other people's expectations. He was no longer a single player on the field, but the image representing the hope of an entire city. And when a person is attached to such a large collective expectation, the line between success and pressure gradually blurs. Even so, on the field, Bruce still showed what made him the #1 selection. His strength, speed, and ability to break through defensive lines quickly made the NFL take notice. But even in his most excellent moments, the feeling of relief did not last. Because every success was not seen as an ending point, but only a new standard for the next time. If he played well today, tomorrow he had to play even better. If he dominated one game, the next game he had to dominate even more strongly. The mental pressure began to accumulate in a way that was not easy to see from the outside. Bruce Smith still played at a high level, still left his mark in every defensive play, but inside him a form of continuous tension began to form. There was no moment when he was truly allowed to be good enough. Everything was pulled forward toward a future where only continuous success was accepted. In the locker room, in team meetings, in every tactical analysis, the name Bruce Smith always appeared as the center of every plan. Opponents built tactics to avoid him. Teammates relied on him to save difficult situations. Coaches adjusted the entire defensive system around him, but that very centrality made him gradually become isolated. When a person becomes the pillar, they are also simultaneously the point where all pressure converges. Buffalo expected Bruce to bring immediate change, but the NFL does not operate on emotion. Even though Bruce played excellently, the team still had to face system limits, collective failures, and gaps that could not be solved by one individual. But in the eyes of the public, that did not matter. Bruce Smith was number one, and number one had to deliver results. Over time, Bruce began to understand that the price of absolute expectation did not lie in having to win, but in never being allowed to just be a normal player. He did not have the right to go through an average season. He did not have the right to have a bad playing day. Everything was tied to the image of a person chosen to change destiny. His individual success could not be separated from collective responsibility, and that created a double pressure that grew heavier. He was not only playing to prove himself, but also to uphold the faith of an entire system that had bet on him from the very first day. Even so, Bruce Smith continued to move forward, not because the pressure disappeared, but because he had become used to living in that pressure. But deep inside, a truth began to form more clearly. Becoming number one was not the destination, but the starting point of a journey, with no right to stop. And from that moment, Bruce Smith's NFL life was no longer the story of a young talent, but the story of a man carrying on his shoulders the entire expectation of a city, stepping onto the field each day not only to play, but to not shatter the faith that others had placed in him long before he could fully understand its meaning. Bruce Smith entered the NFL not like a rookie learning to adapt, but like a long-awaited wave of pressure. Just a short time after joining the Buffalo Bills, he was no longer spoken of as a promising player, but began to be defined by one single word: danger. Bruce's ability to adapt happened almost instantly, not in the gentle way of natural development, but in the explosive way of a man born to break limits. He quickly became one of the most fearsome pass rushers in the league, a real nightmare for any quarterback facing the Bills' defense. Every time the ball was snapped, Bruce Smith did not just move. He charged into the opponent's space like an unstoppable force. The combination of physical strength and explosive speed made him the starting point of all defensive pressure. Opposing teams began to build their entire game plan just to minimize his presence, but the more attention he received, the harder Bruce became to control. He did not only break offensive lines, but also broke the confidence of the people standing opposite him. In the Buffalo Bills' defensive system, Bruce Smith quickly became the absolute center. Every plan, every tactical adjustment, every important decision revolved around his ability. But that did not only bring honor, it also created a new form of pressure, subtle and continuous. He was no longer allowed to just play well. He had to always be the one who made the difference. A game in which he did not leave an immediate mark was immediately seen as a shortcoming, even though in reality he could still play at a high level. Bruce Smith's fame rose rapidly across the NFL. He was not only a good defensive end, but the model of dominance at that position. The media began to describe him as an unavoidable force, a name that every offensive line had to calculate before the game even started. But along with that spotlight, the peace in his life began to disappear. The NFL was no longer a place to play, but became an environment where he always had to be in the highest state of alertness. Every game gradually became a non-stop physical confrontation. The collisions were no longer just moments in the game, but the continuous accumulation of pressure on the body. Bruce Smith began to feel more clearly the changes in himself. The collisions that once were just part of the game now became lasting marks in his body. Shoulders, back, legs, all began to carry a form of fatigue that could not be completely erased after each week of competition. But what was scarier than anything was the change in his own feeling when stepping onto the field. Before, football was the place where Bruce could affirm himself, the place where he felt he was living true to his own value. But as his career progressed deeper, that feeling began to disappear. Instead, a new feeling appeared, not playing, but enduring. Every game was no longer an opportunity to express himself, but a sequence of time that had to be survived, where he had to continuously fight against the wear of his body and the pressure of his role. Meanwhile, Bruce's position in the team became increasingly irreplaceable. But that very irreplaceability made him the point that bore the greatest load. When the team struggled, he was the one expected to create change. When opponents scored, he was the one who had to take responsibility for finding a way to stop them. There was no space for rest in his role, because his presence had become an indispensable part of the entire defensive structure. The more successful he became, the more Bruce Smith realized an unavoidable truth. Dominance did not bring peace. It only extended the chain of pressure into another form. Every individual success did not make him lighter, but only pushed him deeper into a role he could not escape. He was no longer seen as a man playing ball, but as a force that always had to maintain a state of perfection. Fatigue began to appear not only in the body, but also in the rhythm of his mental life. The weeks of competition followed one after another, forming a loop with no clear endpoint. Practice, play, recover, then play again. In that loop, Bruce Smith gradually realized that there was no moment when he was truly allowed to stop. Even when the game ended, his mind still remained on the field, analyzing, adjusting, and preparing for the next time. Bruce's dominance on the field did not diminish, but the price he paid for it became clearer and clearer. He became a true defensive force, but at the same time became a man caught up in that very role. No one saw the subtle shift inside him, from a player playing for joy to a man operating in a continuous state of responsibility. And in that development, a quiet truth gradually formed. Bruce Smith was not only building a great career, but was day by day trading the lightness of life to maintain his position. He became the center of the Buffalo Bills defense, but also the center of pressure that never ended. And from here, football was no longer the place where he sought affirmation, but became the place where he had to continuously prove that he was still strong enough not to be swallowed by his own greatness. The Buffalo Bills entered Super Bowl 25 with a feeling that Bruce Smith had never experienced in his entire NFL journey. Not the tension of a normal game, but the weight of an opportunity that might never come again. The entire season had led them to this moment, where every effort, every sack, every win was condensed into one single game. And in the moment, standing in the middle of the field before the game began, Bruce no longer felt like he was just a defensive end. He clearly felt that he was standing on the boundary between history and emptiness. The game unfolded with the intensity that Bruce Smith was familiar with, but this time everything carried a different feeling. Every collision was not only tactical, but every step forward or backward of an entire collective dream. He still played with his familiar strength, still created pressure on the opposing offensive line, still was one of the bright spots of the Buffalo Bills defense. But the more he played, the more Bruce felt something hard to name. This game was not like the ones before. It was heavier, slower, and every moment carried the feeling of being carved into history. As the game gradually moved toward the end, the truth began to appear unavoidably. The Buffalo Bills were not on the winning side, and when the final whistle sounded, there was no moment of explosion for them. There was only a heavy silence, a silence that Bruce Smith would carry for a very long time afterward. The first Super Bowl loss was not only a failure on the scoreboard, but a mental shock that went far beyond anything he had ever experienced in his career. In that moment, Bruce did not react like a player who had just lost a game. He stood still, as if trying to understand what had really just happened. The feeling that the greatest opportunity of his life had just slipped away did not come noisily, but came in a quietly cruel way. There was no clear warning sign, no single moment that could point out that everything had been lost. It was simply that the game ended, and they were not the winning team. For Bruce Smith, this was the first time he truly understood how wide the gap between glory and reality was. Throughout the journey from Norfolk to Virginia Tech, and then to the NFL, he had always moved forward with the belief that if he was strong enough, fast enough, and enduring enough, victory would come as an inevitable result. But Super Bowl 25 shattered that belief without mercy. He realized that in football, dominance did not always lead to the final result. There were moments when every effort was still not enough. That feeling did not turn Bruce into a weak person, but it changed the way he looked at the world around him. He began to understand that the NFL was not only a place of physical strength, but also a place of decisive moments that no one could fully control. One play, one small mistake, one unlucky moment, all of it could change an entire season. And when that happened on the biggest stage, it was not only a failure, but a lasting psychological scar. The belief inside Bruce Smith did not disappear after that loss, but it began to crack. He was still a dominant player, still continued to create pressure on every offensive line, still maintained his position as one of the best defensive ends in the league. But deep inside, some part of him had changed. Before, he entered every season with the feeling that the peak was waiting ahead if he tried hard enough. But after Super Bowl 25, he began to understand that there were peaks that not only required strength to conquer, but also factors beyond an individual's control. The moment of standing still after that game gradually became an indelible memory. Not because it was too loud, but precisely because it was too quiet. In the silence of the stadium after everyone had left, Bruce Smith, for the first time, clearly felt that football was not only a journey upward, but also a journey of facing limits that could not be overcome by strength alone. And from that point on, every run of his on the field no longer carried only the desire for victory, but also a new awareness. That glory was never certain, no matter how strong you were. After Super Bowl 25, the Buffalo Bills did not fall into silence, but fell into a heavier state. The expectation was still there, but now it was tinged with doubt. Bruce Smith stepped into the following seasons no longer with the feeling of the first opportunity, but with the feeling of continuing an unfinished story that the whole world was waiting to see, whether it would end in glory or tragedy. Super Bowl 26 came like a reminder that the previous failure was not a single accident. The Buffalo Bills once again advanced to the biggest game, once again stood before the chance to make things right, and once again left the field in the silence of the defeated. For Bruce Smith, the feeling this time was no longer like the first shock. It was heavier, deeper, and more dangerous psychologically. Because when a failure repeats, it is no longer an event, but begins to become a pattern. The media began to change its tone. If before the Buffalo Bills were praised as a strong team but unlucky, now they began to be questioned about their mental toughness. And at the center of all those questions, Bruce Smith gradually became the face representing a new concept no one wanted: close but never quite there. He was not the only one on the field, but he was the one most clearly seen, the most recognizable symbol of an entire chain of failures without explanation. By Super Bowl 27, the pressure no longer came from opponents, but from history itself. The Buffalo Bills were not only playing to win, but playing to escape the shadow of the previous failures. But the harder they tried to break free, the deeper they were pulled into the familiar loop. The game ended the same way as the two times before. One team stood on the winning side, and one team stood on the other side of silence. For Bruce Smith, the scariest thing was no longer individual failure, but the repetition of the same feeling. Every time leaving the Super Bowl without the Lombardi Trophy, he not only lost a title, but also lost another part of the belief that effort would be rewarded in a fair way. In the NFL world, where everything is measured by results, the repetition of failure began to turn into a mark that was hard to erase. The mental pressure inside Bruce Smith did not explode into clear actions, but accumulated in a more dangerous way, quietly and continuously. He still trained, still played, still maintained the level of one of the top defensive ends in the league. But inside, every season that passed felt like a new layer of pressure stacked on top of the old ones. There was no release point, no moment that truly broke that loop. There was only continuation. What made everything heavier was the feeling of being missed by history. The Buffalo Bills were not a weak team. Bruce Smith was not a lesser player. They were all very close, many times, and that very phrase, very close, became a form of mental torture. Because in elite sports there are no bonus points for near success. There is only success or failure, and they were continuously placed on the wrong side of that line. Bruce Smith's individual fame continued to rise. He was still recognized as a fearsome defensive force, still dominated individual matchups, still made quarterbacks change the way they played. But a paradox began to appear clearly. The greater he was at the individual level, the more the collective failures stood out. There was no way for one person's fame to completely cover the results the whole team could not achieve. In the locker room, no one directly blamed Bruce Smith, but he understood clearly that every look was directed toward the same unspoken question. How could a team with outstanding players not overcome the final barrier? And even though that question was collective, Bruce still felt it heavier on himself, because he was the clearest symbol of the defense, the one opponents always had to prepare for the most. Over time, the Super Bowl was no longer just a game for Bruce Smith. It became a repeating memory, a familiar pattern of hope and disappointment following one after another. Every year, when the new season began, hope was lit again. And every time the season ended, the feeling of emptiness returned, so familiar it almost became part of reality. But the most painful thing was not the failure itself, but having to continue living in the state of almost success. Because in that state, there was no clear ending point, no moment to close the story, no real release. There was only continuation, year after year. Bruce Smith began to understand that history is not only written by the winners, but is also shaped by those who stood very close to victory, but could never touch it. And even though he continued to play, continued to create excellent moments, a part deep inside him had begun to realize that not every great journey leads to a complete ending. From here, every time the Buffalo Bills stepped into the Super Bowl, it was no longer a completely new opportunity, but the continuation of an old story that had never truly ended. And Bruce Smith, even though he still stood at the center of the defense, still felt that he was carrying the entire weight of the times almost there that had become an inseparable part of his legacy. Super Bowl 28 did not come to the Buffalo Bills like a new opportunity, but like an old door that had been opened too many times, carrying all the memories of the previous failures. When Bruce Smith stepped into this game, he no longer had the feeling of a person touching glory for the first time, nor the explosion of raw hope. Instead, he carried the entire weight of the three previous failures, an invisible pressure so heavy it could almost be felt in every run. The game began with the familiar intensity of the NFL, but for the Buffalo Bills, everything no longer felt new. They had been here too many times. They had seen this light too many times, only for it to go out right before they could touch it. Bruce Smith still played with all his natural strength, still was the center of the defense, still created pressure on the opposing offense, but this time, every movement of his felt slowed down by memory. As the game unfolded, a cold truth gradually appeared. The Buffalo Bills were no longer the team of opportunity, but were becoming the team of historic failure. Every play carried not only tactical meaning, but also the weight of the past. And in that moment, Bruce Smith began to feel more clearly than ever that the Super Bowl was no longer a single game, but a chain of painful memories repeating itself. Super Bowl 28 ended in the way no one in the Buffalo Bills wanted, but in the way they had begun to become frighteningly familiar with. When the final whistle sounded, there was no dramatic collapse, no clear tragic moment, only silence. And that very silence was the cruelest thing, because it did not only end one game, but also confirmed a reality. The greatest opportunity had once again slipped away. For Bruce Smith, the fourth failure no longer carried the shock of the first time, nor the sharp pain of the previous times. It carried a different feeling, the feeling of closure. Not closure in the official sense, but closure in perception. A door he once believed would always have another chance now began to feel distant, as if time was no longer on their side. The Buffalo Bills, from a team admired for its resilience and ability to advance deep, began to become a different symbol in the NFL, the symbol of sports pain. Not because they were weak, but because they were always very close, but never quite enough to touch the final peak. And Bruce Smith, with his role as the representative face of the defense, could not avoid being tightly tied to that image. The media began to build a story that no longer revolved around victory or potential, but around the repetition of failure. The name Bruce Smith appeared in analyses, not only as a defensive legend, but as part of a collective tragedy. Even though he still played at a very high level, even though he was still recognized as one of the best defensive ends in history, the individual numbers gradually became overshadowed by an unchangeable reality. The Super Bowl never ended happily for him and his team. The spirit of the Buffalo Bills after the fourth failure did not collapse immediately, but it declined clearly and quietly. There was no longer the explosion of hope every time a new season began, but an invisible caution. Every time they stepped into the playoffs, the team carried not only faith, but also the memory of the times they had already failed. And that memory, over time, became an invisible opponent that was always present. Bruce Smith felt that more deeply than anyone. He did not talk much about it, but in every season after that, something inside him had changed. It was not a decline in physicality or skill, but a change in the perception of the ability to reach the peak. Before, he always believed that if he continued to try, the final result would come. But after four failures, that belief began to turn into a question without an answer. The feeling that there was no longer a chance to return to the peak did not come suddenly, but formed gradually, through each season that passed without a different ending. No one said directly that the door had closed, but every sign began to point in that direction. In a harsh league like the NFL, where championship opportunities do not come many times in a player's life, the repetition of failure at the most important moment became a crack that was not easy to heal. Bruce Smith continued to play, continued to maintain the presence of a defensive legend, but inside him, the feeling of unfinished began to turn into a quiet form of acceptance. It was not giving up, but understanding that not every great story has a complete ending. And sometimes, greatness lies precisely in the things that are never completed. The Buffalo Bills after that period no longer maintained the same level of pressure as before, not because they immediately became weaker, but because they had reached the limit of what could be achieved. And within that limit, Bruce Smith still stood as a symbol, not of the final victory, but of the journey of almost touching it many times, but never stepping through. When looking back at the chain of four consecutive failures, people do not only see a team denied by history, but also see a man who had spent nearly his entire career peak standing on the boundary between glory and shortfall. And that very boundary, over time, became the place that defined Bruce Smith not only as a player, but as a legend, carrying a wound that never truly healed. Bruce Smith never entered the NFL with the thought that his body would become a cost to be paid gradually over time. But after many years of playing at the highest level, that truth began to appear unavoidably. Football is not only a sport of strength and tactics, but also a slow process of erosion, where every game leaves an invisible mark on the human body. 19 consecutive seasons in the NFL were not just a number, but a long chain of times standing up after collisions, falls that never completely disappeared, and pains that became a familiar part of life. For Bruce Smith, the body was no longer a simple tool for playing, but gradually became a record accumulating everything he had gone through on the football field. Every collision with an offensive lineman, every time charging into a quarterback, every moment of hard landing left a mark, not immediately, but in a quiet and prolonged way. The scariest thing was not one single major injury, but the accumulation of thousands of small collisions, the things the audience never saw. The mornings waking up with a heavy body, The practices that had to start when the pain from the previous week had not completely disappeared, and the games where readiness did not come from a feeling of being healthy, but from the will forcing himself to continue. In the NFL, that was almost the default, and Bruce Smith was no exception. Over time, injuries were no longer events, but became a normal state. There was no longer a clear distinction between healthy and in pain, but only different levels of pain that he learned to accept. A sore shoulder was no longer a reason to stop. A knee was no longer a sign to rest, but only a part of the playing process. And that very normalization was the cruelest thing for a human body. For a defensive end like Bruce Smith, the physical price was always much higher than other positions. Every snap was a direct confrontation with resistance from the offensive line, where strength, technique, and body weight collided in a split second. There was no safe distance, no time to slow down. Everything happened in a tight space, where the body was forced into extreme situations time after time. And when that repeated for nearly 2 decades, it could not help but leave consequences. But what made Bruce Smith special was not only that he endured it, but that he continued to maintain high performance for such a long time. His endurance became part of the definition of his career, but at the same time it was a form of sacrifice that few truly saw. Because endurance in the NFL does not mean not being injured but continuing to play despite the injuries. There were seasons when Bruce stepped onto the field without being in the best condition, but still had to play the central role in the defense. No one on the team could completely replace him, and that very thing forced him to always be present. The system's dependence on one individual made the line between choice and obligation blur. He was not only playing for himself, but also for the structure of the entire team built around him. Gradually, Bruce Smith's body began to reflect what he had been through. The pains no longer completely disappeared between seasons. The old wounds were no longer memories, but became a prolonged present. Recovery was no longer about returning to the old self, but only returning to a level where he could continue playing. And in the NFL world, that was already enough. There was no season that was truly light for Bruce Smith. Even the years when he did not face serious injury, his body still had to operate under continuous load. Every week of competition was a new cycle of collision, recovery, then collision again. There was no real stopping point, only the transition between different levels of fatigue. Bruce Smith's 19-year career, therefore, was not only a story about achievements, but also a story about unavoidable erosion. Every season that passed brought more experience, more fame, but also took away a part of the wholeness of his body. And the irony was that the more successful he became, the longer he was pulled into that chain of erosion. Because success kept him from stopping earlier. Seen from the outside, Bruce Smith was a symbol of endurance. But inside, it was a continuous process of learning to live with the limits of the body. There was no longer the feeling of unbreakable, but only the acceptance that everything has a price, and the price of playing at the highest level of the NFL for nearly 2 decades was unavoidable. When looking back at the entire journey, 19 years were not only the time he existed in the league, but the time he continuously paid with his own body to maintain his position. And in the silence of those prolonged pains, Bruce Smith gradually understood that greatness in sports is not only measured by what you achieve, but also by what you are forced to trade to be able to stand there for so long. Bruce Smith's 200 sacks did not come to him as a normal number in the NFL stat sheet. It came as a prolonged affirmation that lasted nearly 2 decades, an imprint that cannot be erased from the history of American football. When he surpassed that milestone, the entire expert community was forced to pause and rethink the way they defined a defensive end. Bruce Smith was not only an outstanding player, he became the standard for that position, a model that every generation after him had to compare themselves to. But while the numbers were recorded in history, the feeling inside Bruce Smith was much more complex. Every sack was not just a statistic, but the result of thousands of hours of training, hundreds of games, and countless body collisions. And even though the number 200 carried symbolic meaning, it could not cover up one thing he always carried: the question about the Super Bowl ring he had never had. In the NFL, great individual numbers are always honored, but they do not exist in a vacuum. They are always placed next to a harsher, more collective standard: the championship. And it was at this point that Bruce Smith began to step into a form of debate that no statistic could resolve. He could be one of the greatest defensive ends in history, but the question, with a ring or without, always appeared like a shadow that followed him. Every time Bruce Smith was mentioned in GOAT discussions, his silence became part of the story. He did not react sharply, did not try to argue or defend himself with words. That silence was not agreement, but more like an acceptance that there are standards in sports that cannot be controlled by an individual. He let his career speak for itself instead of trying to change the way others perceived it. But inside, that silence did not mean there were no emotions. Bruce Smith clearly understood the value of what he had achieved, but he also clearly understood the way the world evaluates success. In the NFL, where the Super Bowl is seen as the ultimate peak, everything else can be placed beneath it. And that created a painful paradox: an almost perfect individual career, but always marked with a question when viewed from the collective perspective. Bruce Smith's individual honors were very complete: Hall of Fame, multiple Pro Bowls, All-Pro selections, Defensive Player of the Year, and especially the sack record. But those honors, no matter how great, still could not by themselves fill the void of the Lombardi Trophy. In the eyes of the public, they existed side by side, but they could never replace each other. This created a special form of pressure that only legends like Bruce Smith could experience. He was not viewed as a failure, but he was also never seen as complete in some discussions. And it was from there that an image began to form: Sack King without the final crown, the king of sacks but without the final crown. Bruce Smith did not argue against that. He did not need to. His career was already too clear. But that clarity did not mean simplicity. It carried within it a complexity that only those who truly followed the entire journey could understand. That football is not only about the final result, but also about the entire process that stretches across decades. In the final years of his career and after retirement, the GOAT debates appeared more and more. Comparisons between generations, between positions, between different standards, and Bruce Smith always appeared in those discussions as a special case. No one could deny him, but no one fully agreed on how to place him in a single position. The truth is, Bruce Smith never tried to become the answer to every debate. He only tried to become the best he could be in his role. But professional sports do not only remember intention, they remember results. And in that system, the Super Bowl ring became an unavoidable symbol. There were moments when Bruce Smith stood on the edge of every debate, listening but not participating. Not because he had nothing to say, but because he understood that there are things that cannot be explained with words. 200 sacks do not need to be justified, but they are also not enough to end every question. Over time, Bruce Smith's image gradually stabilized in NFL history. He was mentioned as one of the greatest defensive ends of all time, a standard that others had to aim for. But parallel to that honor, there still existed a symbolic shortfall. Not in his career, but in the way people retold it. And perhaps that is exactly what gives depth to Bruce Smith's story. It is not a story of absolute victory, but the story of a man who reached the highest possible level individually, but still had to live with a question that never had a fully complete answer. In his silence, Bruce Smith did not try to change history. He only let history define him the way it wanted. And even though the final crown never came, 200 sacks still stood there, as an affirmation that greatness does not always need a perfect ending to exist forever. When Bruce Smith left the Buffalo Bills to join the Washington Redskins, it was not a noisy farewell or a dramatic ending. It happened in the quiet of a period when his entire career seemed to be stepping into a different chapter. No longer the center of every gaze, no longer the name that every defensive plan had to revolve around. It was a shift not only in teams, but also in his position in the very world he had once dominated. In Buffalo, Bruce Smith had been an irreplaceable symbol, the starting point of every defensive tactic. But in Washington, that role began to change noticeably. He was still an experienced player, still carried the reputation of a legend, but he was no longer the absolute center of the system. Time did not completely take away his ability, but it began to adjust the way he was used, the way he was expected, and the way he appeared on the field. The gradual reduction in role did not happen suddenly, but like a natural yet irreversible process. The explosive plays were still there, but the frequency was no longer the same as before. The moments of dominance still appeared, but they no longer shaped the entire game. Bruce Smith was still Bruce Smith, but the world around him had changed, and the NFL is always a place where no one can stand still. In Washington, he began to witness the generational transition more clearly than ever. Young players appeared with new energy, new speed, and a different approach to the game. They looked at Bruce Smith with the respect due to a legend, but also with the distance of people belonging to a different era. And in that distance, Bruce began to feel something familiar, but this time more profound. The shift of time does not need an announcement. No longer the center of every tactic, Bruce Smith had to adapt to a new role, one of leading more through experience than through absolute dominance. He was no longer the one every play had to go through, but became a part of a larger structure, where each individual had their own role. This did not diminish his value, but it changed the way he existed in the game. On the field, Bruce still played with his professional approach, still maintained the ability to create pressure, still was a threat to opposing offensive lines. But among those moments, there was a subtle difference. He no longer had to carry the entire responsibility of the team on his shoulders. That brought a certain lightness, but at the same time carried the feeling that a central part of his career had been left behind. The transition to the new generation did not happen as a direct replacement, but as a natural shift in the flow of the NFL. New names gradually appeared more in discussions, in highlights, in the team's long-term plans. Bruce Smith was not removed, but he was gradually placed in a different context, the context of experience and legacy, rather than the future. And it was in this period that the silence began to become clearer in his journey. There were no longer debates about how he would change the team, no longer absolute expectations like in the Buffalo days. Instead, there was quiet recognition, a legend continuing to play ball in the final stage of his career, not to prove anything new, but to complete a journey that had lasted nearly 2 decades. The final years in Washington were not a decline, but a gradual reduction in intensity. Bruce Smith did not fall from the peak in one moment, but gradually withdrew from the central position he had once held. He was still an important part of the team, but no longer the sole symbol. His role became more stable, quieter, and less placed under constant scrutiny. In that silence there was a feeling that was hard to name. It was not failure, not loss, but the natural transition of a career that had lasted too long at the highest level. Bruce Smith no longer had to race against expectations like before, but he was also no longer standing at the intersection between hope and the peak. He was in the stage where everything became clearer, but also less dramatic. When the end of his career drew near, it did not come with an explosion of emotion or a final spotlight. It came quietly, similar to the way the Washington period had unfolded. There was no dramatic closure, only acceptance. A great career does not end with a big period, but with a long silence, where everything gradually recedes into the background and makes way for a new chapter, no longer as a player, but as a memory. In 2003, Bruce Smith officially closed his professional playing career. There was no dramatic final whistle, No explosive emotional moment like what people often imagine for the farewell of a legend. It was simply the end of a journey that had lasted nearly 2 decades, where his body, will, and reputation had been placed under the continuous pressure of the NFL. And when it all stopped, what remained was not the stage lights, but silence. Leaving the stadium meant Bruce Smith was leaving the sounds that had been tied to his life for most of his adult years. The sound of bodies colliding, the roar of the crowd, the calls of tactics, and the tense rhythm of every snap. When those sounds disappeared, the space around him became empty in a way that no preparation could soften. It was not only a change in environment, but the disappearance of a world that had once defined his entire identity. In the early days after retirement, Bruce Smith faced a state that many great athletes often encounter but no one really speaks clearly about: the feeling of no longer having a clear goal. For 19 seasons, everything in his life had been structured around football. Training schedule, games, tactics, recovery, expectations. Every week had a specific goal. Every season had a clear destination. But when it all stopped, that structure disappeared completely. There were no more games to prepare for, no specific opponents to analyze, no coaches to report to. And Bruce Smith began to step into a period where everything became expanded but lacked direction. Mornings no longer had to head to the practice field. Afternoons no longer involved video analysis. Evenings no longer carried the anticipation of a game. Time became spread out, but no longer carried a clear meaning. The feeling of emptiness began to appear not as a shock, but as a quiet permeation into every moment. His body still carried the marks of a professional athlete, but it was no longer used in the old way. The reflexes that had been trained through thousands of hours of practice no longer had an environment to express themselves. The transition from always ready to no longer needing to be ready was a much deeper change than what outsiders could see. In the silence after the stadium, Bruce Smith began to have time to look back at his entire journey. A long career full of individual success, full of physical dominance, but also full of pressure and moments that were almost never complete at the collective level. The Super Bowl losses, the peak seasons but lacking a perfect ending, the years placed under non-stop expectations. All of it began to appear more clearly when there was no longer the noise of competition to cover it. What made this period special was not simple regret, but the internal questions that began to form naturally. What is the real meaning of success? Bruce Smith did not lack individual honors, did not lack recognition, did not lack records, but when there was no longer a goal ahead to aim for, he began to look back at the entire journey from a different angle, not from the perspective of a player still competing, but from the perspective of a man who had walked the entire road. In football, success is always clearly defined by numbers, wins, and titles. But in the silence of life after retirement, those definitions began to become more complex. Bruce Smith began to realize that there are parts of success that cannot be measured, and there are also parts that are never completed, no matter how great the career is. With no clear sports goals left, he was forced to face a completely new mental space. It was not the pressure of competition, but the freedom without structure. And that very freedom brought another form of challenge. The challenge of finding meaning again when there was no longer a clear defining role. In those quiet moments, Bruce Smith was no longer the legendary defensive end, no longer the record holder for sacks, no longer the symbol of Buffalo or Washington. He was simply a man trying to understand everything he had been through. And the biggest question was not about what he had achieved, but how those things defined him when all the lights had gone out. A career can end in one afternoon, but the silence afterward lasts much longer than any season. And in that silence, Bruce Smith began to step into a different journey. No longer the journey of an athlete, but the journey of a man trying to rediscover the meaning of the very years that had made him a legend. Bruce Smith was officially inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame in 2009. a moment when his entire nearly two-decade career was placed under the formal and eternal light of NFL history. In that space where the greatest legends of American football are honored, the name Bruce Smith was no longer just a player, but became part of the sporting legacy of America. It was the official recognition that what he had done belonged not only to one era, but to the entire history of the game. Bruce Smith's 200 sacks were mentioned as a symbolic number, but in the Hall of Fame, it was not just a statistic. It became a standard, a measure that every defensive end afterward had to look at when evaluating themselves. Not everyone could reach it, and that was why it stood there as an almost untouchable milestone in NFL history. But what was more important than the number was the way Bruce Smith achieved it. Not in a short, explosive season, but across 19 years of facing the strongest offensive lines, the best quarterbacks, and constantly changing tactical systems. When looking back at Bruce Smith's entire career, the expert community was forced to admit that he was not only one of the greatest defensive ends, but also the one who redefined that position. Before Bruce Smith, the defensive end was mainly seen as part of the defensive system. After Bruce Smith, that position became a strategic weapon that could change the entire complexion of the game. His presence on the field forced opponents to change the way they attacked, adjust their protection schemes, and dedicate more resources just to control one single man. Comparisons between Bruce Smith and other NFL legends like Reggie White, Lawrence Taylor, or other generations of defensive linemen always led to endless debates. Each had a different style, era, and system. But the common point that Bruce Smith always held firm was non-stop endurance. It was not just an explosion in one period, but the ability to maintain elite level for nearly 2 decades, something very few defensive players could do at a similar level. However, Bruce Smith's legacy always carried a special layer of debate. He was an undeniable legend, but also one of the names always placed next to the question about the Super Bowl ring. That did not diminish his value in the eyes of those who understood football deeply, but in popular discussions, it became an unavoidable factor. And it was the parallel existence between individual greatness and collective shortfall that created a legacy that was both brilliant and complex. Bruce Smith never spent too much energy arguing about his place in the GOAT rankings. His silence in those debates carried a special meaning. It was not avoidance, but a clear understanding that the value of a career cannot be reduced to a single debate. He let the numbers, the games, and the years of playing define him, and over time, that very silence made his image even more solid in history. In the eyes of many, Bruce Smith was the symbol of pure defensive strength, but in the depth of NFL history, he was also the symbol of non-stop perseverance, a man who not only reached the peak, but maintained it long enough to change the way an entire position was understood and evaluated. Not every legend is defined by one moment, and Bruce Smith was clear proof of that. His legacy did not only lie in the games won, the sacks recorded, or the honors received. It lay in the way he existed across 19 seasons at the highest level, facing the changes of the NFL, facing collective failures, and still continuing to hold his place among the greatest players. That was a type of legacy that was not loud, but enduring. Even so, the very perfection on the individual level, but the absence of the final trophy, made Bruce Smith's legacy always carry a special emotional layer. For some, he was proof of greatness that did not need to be complete. For others, he was the symbol of the question, what if? And that very multidimensional quality made his name never confined to a single definition. When looking back at his entire career, Bruce Smith was remembered not only as an outstanding defensive end, he was remembered as a man who redefined perseverance, dominance, and the limits of a human being in one of the harshest sports in America. His legacy did not lie in one single moment, but in the entire journey that stretched across nearly 2 decades, a journey of non-stop forward movement despite pressure, failure, and questions that never had fully complete answers. When looking back at Bruce Smith's entire journey, it is hard to simply call him a great football player because his story goes far beyond statistical numbers or individual honors. From a boy growing up in an environment of discipline and pressure in Norfolk, Virginia, where emotion was replaced by expectation, to becoming the #1 overall selection in the NFL Draft in 1985 by the Buffalo Bills, Bruce Smith lived a life shaped by non-stop demands. He became a defensive symbol with more than 200 sacks, dominated the NFL for nearly 2 decades, but at the same time carried deep wounds from 4 consecutive Super Bowl failures, where the line between glory and shortfall became the cruelest. What makes his story heartbreaking is not a lack of talent, but the incompleteness at the collective level. Even though individually he had reached an almost absolute peak, the years with the Buffalo Bills turned him into the face of both hope and failure, while the Washington Redskins period showed the quietness of time as a legend gradually moved away from the center. Even when stepping into the Hall of Fame, the question about the final ring still followed him like a shadow, reflecting the way the world sometimes evaluates success more by results than by the journey. From Bruce Smith's life, people learn that greatness does not always come with completeness. Success can exist alongside loss, and a man can reach the peak while still carrying a void that cannot be filled. In American culture, where victory is often absolutely honored, his story reminds us that the real value of a person lies not only in the final title, but also in perseverance, discipline, and the ability to stand firm through repeated failure. Bruce Smith is not only an NFL legend, but also proof that sometimes the deepest greatness lies in the things that are never completed. If the story of Bruce Smith makes you feel both the glory and the void behind greatness, please hit subscribe to accompany us on the journeys behind sports legends. Thank you for watching until the end, and see you in the next video, where we continue to explore stories that are not only about victory, but also about the real price of greatness.